and welcome to the latest episode of the Dialogue Out Loud series. I'm Taylor Petrey, editor of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Today, I'm excited to have with me Charles Harrell, a retired associate professor of manufacturing engineering at Brigham Young University and author of This Is My Doctrine, The Development of Mormon Theology, with Koford Books in 2011. In his recent article, John Taylor on the Dark Ages, he corrects a well-used historical error that misunderstood former LDS prophet John Taylor's thoughts on the Dark Ages, a key to a larger argument about how Latter-day Saints are understanding the so-called Great Apostasy. Charlie, welcome. It's so nice to talk to you about your work.
Well, thank you, Taylor. It's good to be here, and I'm excited and looking forward to talking about it.
So let's dive right in here. We've got a fascinating story of a kind of modern rewriting and re-understanding of the traditional Great Apostasy narrative. Before we get into how John Taylor fits into that specifically, can you kind of describe the older and the newer models that that people have been putting forward, and then we'll see how John Taylor fits into that story?
Sure. There is the traditional Latter-day Saint view of the apostasy, which most people, most members at least, are familiar with. And I should say, I would dare say that many non-LDS are also familiar with, because it's kind of a disparaging narrative that minimizes the impact of God's dealings with humankind on the earth during the period of the apostasy. So the traditional view is that following the death of the apostles in the early 1st and 2nd centuries, the lights went out, so to speak, and God's power, his priesthood, and the gifts of the Spirit, the gospel, was withdrawn from the earth, leaving a closed heaven for 1800 years until the time of the Restoration. And with the Restoration, finally, the heavens were opened, God's voice was heard, angels continued or started returning to the earth again, appearing to humans, and revelation continued. So that's the traditional narrative, which many Christians and even Latter-day Saints have sort of questioned in some respects, because the history tends to portray a little different story about God's dealings with humankind, rather than the harsh, savage, medieval period that has been projected.
Yeah, so we started to see a variety of people, maybe 20 years ago or so, start to call into question this narrative in Latter-day Saint discourse, both from a theological perspective about the implications that it was saying about, God's involvement in justice in the world, and, as you mentioned, a historical critique of this a little bit. And John Taylor became a kind of linchpin in that. Can you talk a little bit about how that story was getting retold, and how John Taylor's teachings specifically were becoming influential in retelling the Great Apostasy story?
Yeah, that's very interesting. As you mentioned, it happened just about 20 years ago, specifically in 2003 was the first time that this remark by John Taylor was rediscovered, uncovered. Here it had been laying dormant for 130 years. Nobody made any fuss about it or made mention or reference to it at all. And then suddenly, starting with Eric Dursteller, who published this groundbreaking landmark article or essay on rethinking the apostasy back in 2003, and he argued for a more conciliatory view of the apostasy, contending that the Dark Ages were not this period of intellectual darkness and spiritual darkness, but that there was more going on, and that God was working among humanity to further his kingdom in whatever form that might be. And at the end of his essay, he said, don't just take my word for it, effectively. He said the justification and precedents, historical precedents, those are the terms he used, the justification and historical precedents for this new narrative and way of thinking about the apostasy is this 1873 quote by John Taylor. And I don't know if it's worth reading that.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Briefly, because it's so significant, and it left everybody with the impression, and I think Dursteller achieved his desired effect with it. John Taylor said, there were men in those dark ages who could commune with God and who, by the power of faith, could draw aside the curtain of eternity and gaze upon the invisible world. There were men who could tell the destiny of the human family and the events which would transpire throughout every subsequent period of time until the final winding up scene. There were men who could gaze upon the face of God, have ministering of angels, and unfold future destinies of the world. If those were dark ages, I pray God to give me a little darkness.
It's such a great quote for a lot of reasons, and we'll talk about how you correct, I think, a misunderstanding of it in a moment. But it does seem to suggest on that first reading that the medieval Christians are the people who he's talking about, and that in fact they were not benighted, lost souls, fallen away from God, but rather seem to have access to divine revelation throughout all of the years of the Great Apostasy. And you, I think, rightly point out that the Dursteller argument is a real turning point in the history of LDS scholarship and rewriting of the Great Apostasy story. We were talking before we started recording that you and I actually met at a pivotal conference on this topic in 2012-ish or so at BYU that resulted in the publication of a volume, Standing Apart, Mormon Conceptions of the Apostasy with Oxford, something like that. I don't recall the exact title. But that was, really building on this critique that Dursteller by then had nearly 10 years before had made. So tell us a little bit about what the impact of that Taylor quote was in subsequent scholarship on the Great Apostasy, because you kind of trace out that it comes to be taken on by a variety of different scholars, right?
Yes, that's right. And I've watched with interest how that statement was used over the years to really promote this more charitable and highly spiritual period that the Dark Ages were. And so after the several conferences and publications, and I list three in the article, the 2003 Dursteller article, and then Early Christianity in Disarray was another Farms publication in 2005, which built on that same thesis premise. And then, of course, the Standing Apart, published in 2014, the symposium proceedings. And in all of those, Dursteller's article was kind of the lead article in it to set the stage for this revised narrative of the apostasy, which I think has continued to this day in terms of really laying the groundwork for a much more charitable view of the apostasy and way of viewing larger Christianity and more specifically the Catholic tradition and leading into the Protestant tradition. So in fact, soon after that, there was Alexander Morrison. He was a retired General Authority 70. He wrote a book on the apostasy, trying to soften the perception that LDS traditionally had of those dark ages as being a time of a closed-off spirituality. And then that was followed by a barrage of publications by most notably Robert Millett and the Givenses. They each published 4 or 5 volumes talking about different topics, gospel topics. They weren't all devoted to the apostasy, but when they did talk about the apostasy, and of course, these books were largely written to appease either a non-LDS audience or even the more, I don't want to say the thinking group, but a lot of the intellectuals, I think, in Mormonism, to persuade them that the apostasy really wasn't that bad. It wasn't as dark as we have imagined and portrayed it as being. So, and inevitably, they would turn to the John Taylor quote as the principal justification for it. Now, there are other statements, of course, that have been made about how there were righteous people that lived during the apostasy. And this has always been part of the LDS narrative, that not everybody was evil, of course, and that God was still moving upon the nations to, of course, prepare for his restoration of the gospel in the latter days. The Book of Mormon talks about the Spirit moving upon the Gentiles, upon a Gentile, Columbus, to come to America and so forth. So there's always been this element of the light of Christ and a portion of the Spirit that has worked with people, but the full gospel blessings, the gifts of the Spirit that are only available through priesthood ordinances, through the fullness of the gospel, those blessings, that level of spiritual endowment had been withdrawn. Again, that's the traditional narrative, but now with this Taylor quote, that raised the upper limit to what we can attribute in the way of spirituality to the Middle Ages, to people living in the Middle Ages. And so I think people breathed a lot easier and felt now more emboldened to make such declarations that basically we have, or that the people in the Middle Ages had the same level of spirituality or spiritual outpouring among righteous Christians as we experience in the church today, or that you can read in biblical times.
So this leads to really the crux of your argument and the payoff of this great article here, which is that you come to doubt this interpretation of Taylor, that that maybe he doesn't mean what we are assuming that he means here. So will you tell us a little bit about why you first started to doubt this particular interpretation that was being put forward of Taylor's words, not of the whole rewriting of the Great Apostasy, but specifically of Taylor, and what the insight and alternative interpretation that you put forward is?
Okay. So what I discovered, and I felt this when I first heard this quote being used, that here Taylor's talking about some over-the-top spiritual experiences. I mean, gazing on the face of God, the administration of angels, being able to declare the whole workings of God from the beginning of the world to the end. I mean, these are things that are far and above anything that any Latter-day Saint prophet or otherwise had ever attributed to people living during the Dark Ages.
Sounds too good to be true, huh?
That's right. Yeah. So there was something about it that just didn't set right. And so I started looking at the sermon a little closer and thought, wait a minute, he's not talking about people living in the Dark Ages. but he's referring to people in those dark ages of the world. And so there must have been an antecedent for use of the word those dark ages. And I looked through the sermon and I discovered that all he ever refers to, the only people he refers to, are people living in biblical times, Old and New Testament times, and Book of Mormon times. But nowhere does he ever talk about or refer to people living during the Middle Ages. So I thought he can't be talking about the Middle Ages. That was my kind of rough hypothesis to begin with, initial hypothesis. So I looked through the sermon more closely and found out that, or it seemed to me that, yeah, he's talking about people in biblical times, but why would he call those the Dark Ages? So this points out another thing that sometimes we overlook in LDS discourse today, is that people in former times often had a different way of thinking about things and the way they described things. They had different meanings. So if we look at the definition of terms that we use today, like Dark Ages, something comes to mind today that is not necessarily the same meaning that was evoked to people who heard it at the time it was uttered. So sometimes terms and expressions, they change meaning. Sometimes a particular meaning is lost or dropped. And that's what seems to be occurring here. Today, we just don't think about referring to biblical times as the Dark Ages. But as I looked at other discourses of John Taylor in particular, beginning back in 1840 all the way up until the 1880s, he made reference to the Dark Ages several times, never referring to the medieval Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but always in reference to ancient biblical times. So that was a real eye-opener for me as well. I mean, I could have easily fallen into the same trap of presentist reading of that remark. So then I looked at other sermons that his associates gave and discovered a whole anti-cessationist rhetoric, I'll call it, that was taking place during the 19th century in Mormonism that has just faded. I mean, it just almost disappeared as we entered into the 20th century. So that by the time Dursteller pulled Taylor's quote and we started rereading it, we were totally oblivious, or we were ignorant of this discourse, this rhetoric that prevailed during the 19th century in Mormonism. So that's kind of the discovery process that I went through to determine what he was actually referring to.
Charlie, thank you so much for sharing this research with us today. Your conclusions are so important, and this is really, I think, an essential piece for people who are interested in the history of LDS ideas on the Great Apostasy, and really changes the scholarship of the narrative moving forward, calling into question this linchpin piece of evidence that so many have used to offer an alternative understanding here. So I hope that it's widely read and widely understood, and we're so grateful for the work that you put into telling this story.
Well, thanks, Taylor. And let me just interject.
Yeah.
One last thing, because I really do appreciate the narrative that it created.
Yeah.
It's just the basis or the justification for that narrative that I think we need to just be cautious about.
I think that's a really important distinction, and I hope that everybody reads the article, gets that here, that you're not making the argument for the traditional case of the apostasy, but rather the evidence that is sometimes put forward in terms of laying out an alternative history here. Is that a fair way of?
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we hope that our listeners have enjoyed the conversation and have learned something new. If you'd like to learn more, check out the article John Taylor on the Dark Ages in the spring 2025 issue of Dialogue, and explore other resources on this topic there as well. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues, and don't forget to leave us a review or get in touch with any comments or questions. We hope that you'll tune in to future episodes of our podcast, so please subscribe and rate the show, and be sure to check out the whole range of shows in the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.